Hi, and welcome to episode 10 of the Well Bible Reading Journey podcast. I'm so glad that you could join us this week, and I pray that God is blessing you. This week, we're going to be going through Genesis chapter 28, 29, and 30, Psalm chapter 10, and Matthew chapter 10. Those are the chapters we're covering in the well this week. And so I want to get right into the discussion. There's so much to discuss here. I don't want to waste any time. So we're going to start not now, but right now. I want to invite Amber and Craig to come in and join the discussion. Amber and Craig, thanks for being here again.
Hello, hello.
Good to see you guys. Hey,
for having
welcome back,
us.
Craig. I'm glad
Thank
you're
you.
back. Did you have a good time with your family?
I did really appreciate you guys covering for us so we could spend some time. But
Absolutely.
I'm super glad to be back in the saddle and be back here.
Yeah, I'm glad you're back. Okay, so we're talking about Genesis chapter 30. We're going to focus on Genesis chapter 30, even though we're covering 28, 29, and 30, and they all kind of work together and lead into each other. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time on Matthew chapter 10. But let's begin with Genesis chapter 30. And this, of course, is the story of Jacob as we continue the story of the patriarchs. And so, Amber, why don't we just kind of start with you? Is there something that just leaped off the page at you, some kind of a theme or anything like that?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the very first thing you notice is right at the very first sentence of this chapter is just the brokenness and the selfishness and the envy of this family. It's narrowing into Rachel here, but it's been going on. If you envy is kind of this funny word where it's this feeling of unhappiness for someone else's good fortune, right? And not only that, but you want that good fortune for yourself. And that's what kind of envy is. And you can really see this in this story. You know that Leah earlier in chapter 29, we see Leah say and envy and have pain over the fact that if only I had my sister's beauty and the love of my husband, then I would be happy.
Yeah.
And then you see here in these verses, Rachel saying the same thing. She's feeling pain. She's having envy. If only I could give my husband a son like my sister has, then I would be happy.
Yeah.
And it reminded me that so often we do that. We tend to look at other people and what people have, or other people's good fortune, and instead of setting our eyes on God. And I just was reminded that it's not that wanting to have a son is inherently bad.
No.
Or not wanting your husband's love for you is not inherently bad. It was just the way that they focused on it. It was the envy for the other one that was pointed out. And I'm speculating here, but I wonder sometimes if they would have focused on God and said, hey, God, I would love the love of my husband, or hey, God, I would love a son, if things would have been a little different in the relationship with the family. Yeah. I think that ultimately God's promise God would have still made 12 sons, but maybe the relationship between the family would have been a little healthier.
Oh, absolutely. And this whole theme of competition and jealousy and manipulation. So you have Jacob's character, which we've already gotten a taste of. He's a trickster. He's a manipulator. But then he meets almost his match in his uncle Laban, who's also a kind of a manipulator and trickster. And the trickster kind of gets a taste of his own medicine, right? In chapter 28 and 29, where he's tricked into marrying both daughters, right? So there is definitely that theme. And when you said that, this is a silly analogy, but I think growing up, it always amazed me how people with curly hair envied those who had straight hair, and people who had straight hair wanted curly hair. And I always had wavy hair, which I hated. And it's crazy how we're always wanting what we don't have and what someone else have. Yeah, Craig, did you see I know you saw that the competition and jealousy. Was there anything else in here that kind of popped out at you?
Yeah, it's really central. The jealousy that y'all point out is central in chapter 30. It kind of hits us square in the chest with the petty bickering between Leah and Rachel. It's really amazing. And then until I realized that, I do the same thing, we do the same thing in our own lives. But really, you talked about in chapter 29 how Jacob gets his own medicine, that the deceiver becomes the deceived. Even rolling back to chapter 28, though, it's important to set the context that we're coming in with Jacob, kind of entering the story in his own right, with chapter 28 showing the dream that he has with the first dream, with the angels ascending and descending the ladder between earth and heaven, and God really then making the promise personal with Jacob, his own promise with Jacob. God continues to narrow down the self-identification that he's giving of himself to his people. At this point, to his person who becomes Jacob. I'm the God of your father Abraham and Isaac, and now you. And here's what I'm going to promise you. But Jacob can't leave it there. He's got to add his own kind of provisions to the covenant. He says, "That's great, God, and I'll do what you say as long as you protect me while I'm traveling and give me food and clothing." So even when he's confronting God, he's always got to be wrestling a little bit more. He's got to be trying to trick that little bit much more out of the condition that we see himself or he sees himself in. And so he does get the agreement with God, and they do establish the covenant personally between Jacob and God, and that becomes at that place the stone that Jacob was resting on, a pillow for his head, becomes a pillar of worship and a sanctuary that Jacob sets up for God and for him to come back to. He names it Bethel, house of the Lord. And this is another example. We've seen this throughout Genesis, and we'll continue to see it throughout the Bible. This idea of what the Celtic Christians call this thin places. If heaven is truly where God is, it's not so much a place in the cosmos, it's where God is. And if this is when God rushes into the world and interacts with us, we see heaven and earth overlapping and interlocking. And we see this sense of what Jesus talks about in the New Testament of the kingdom of God is in hand and it's rushing in. This is God literally rushing into our space, and Jacob is interacting with them. And we'll see as we progress that this is really the last time that God is going to make a personal one-on-one covenant until, of course, we have Moses and Jesus ultimately. But right. In this line in Genesis, we start to pivot with Jacob's children, where the promise that God makes is with the entire clan, entire 12 siblings. It goes from being a chosen person to the chosen people, and Israel becoming that chosen people as we go forward.
Yeah, no, that's really good. That's really good. And we see this character of Jacob. One of the interesting things about that, as you said, where he reaffirms the Abrahamic promise he did it with Abraham, he did it with Isaac, and now he's doing it with Jacob. Extremely important. So that promise is continuing through that line. But how God uses these like imperfect people, really, in some ways, dysfunctional people, because the dysfunctionality or dysfunctional traits of Jacob really are passed down. His whole family becomes the same way. They all start manipulating, don't they? A big part of this story is Rachel and her manipulations, right? So, what's up with that? For instance, this place where they're going back and forth and almost trying to one-up each other.
Yeah.
Amber, did you see that in that relationship where Leah and Rachel are really, it's vicious, right?
I did. I was thinking about this and I was like, I kind of felt bad for all the other members in this story. They feel like they're being used as pawns. Yeah. And then I was like, more than pawns, it's almost like they're playing a poker game where like one of them is like, I bid you one wife and the love and beauty. And one's like, well, I will up you a wife and give you 4 sons. And then the other one's like, well, I will up you that and I'll give you my servant and she'll give you 2 sons. It's like a poker game. It's like nobody wins here. It's just a really bad gambling game. Like it's just bad gambling. In fact, I think it just really ruins the family. And then that related to me when I got to the very end of this chapter, very end of this Rachel part where God remembers Rachel and she does end up having a son. What made me so sad about that is that she finally bears a son after all this back and forth poker game. And she doesn't even have the ability to notice and give praise or thanksgiving or graciousness. Immediately, she just says, may the Lord add another son to me. She just wants more. She wants to continue this competition. And my heart was so sad because it really reminds me of people who do gamble. So when you get so caught up in being desperate, when people are desperate or they're having an addiction of some sort, which this is sort of what's going on here, is right. Even when you get the thing you wanted, it's never enough. Mm-hmm. You need more. So you might win a big game. You might win a game that you're playing poker or something, but that's never enough because you'll put it all back on the table and go after another one. And that's when you lose it all. And I feel like that's what's happening here. It makes me so sad to watch this story where Rachel finally gets that son. And then she just kind of was like, it's not enough. I want more. She just, I don't know. That just really hit me hard.
That's Joseph's name. That's what it means, right? Add another, right? That's very interesting. It all does this whole chapters 28, 29, and 30. It's all really leading up to and setting up this verse 22, chapter 30, verse 22, where after all the manipulations that Rachel had gone through and Leah and all the bitterness and the anger and the petty, really petty jealousies going on, at the end of the day, it really comes back to God in verse 22, where it says that God remembered, God listened, and God opened up her womb and gave her a son, right? It's a big climactic moment, and it's all God. Nothing else really worked, right? Because it's an interesting scene with the mandrake cakes, right?
Yeah.
That's weird. I mean, that she's bartering. I mean, she's actually saying, "Give me the mandrake cakes, and you can sleep with my husband, right? Tonight, your husband. You get to sleep with him." Rachel almost seems to have this power over who Jacob sleeps with, apparently, and is willing to say, "You can have him for one night if you give me the cakes." What's happening there? Amber,
Right.
did you get anything from the mandarin cakes? Did you study that at all?
Yeah, I did. This is so interesting. So Reuben, who is the oldest of all the sons, he's probably around age 7 or so here. I did some looking up, and it's about harvest time. So he's out doing his work, what he would be doing to help the family, right? It's a
Mm-hmm.
family business. And when he was out doing the work, the harvest time, he came across this field of mandrakes. What's this, right? Well,
Mm-hmm.
mandrakes are these orange colored fruit that grew on these bushes, and they were called love apples, actually. And they were thought to have fertility powers. And what's really interesting about them is that when you pull up the root, they actually kind of look like a little baby. And for those who are big Harry Potter fans, you actually see this in Harry Potter, the Chamber of Secrets, that scene where they are pulling up the little seedlings and they scream. And it says if you pull up the adult ones, they will kill you. That's how bad they scream. And they pull them up, they look like little ugly babies. And that
Yeah,
actually, when you look them up, that's actually how they look like.
right.
And people to this day actually still believe they have fertility powers. So you see Rachel trying to use magic here, trying to
Right.
use magic to get fertile. And she does, but it's not because of her and the magic, it's because of God, which is
No,
important.
no. In fact, the mandrake cakes end up working for Leah more than they do for
That's
Rachel.
exactly
Rachel
right.
says,
That's
"Give me the
exactly
mandrake
right.
cakes, I'll take them," and she doesn't. She doesn't get pregnant, but Leah got to sleep with Jacob, and she ends up
Yep,
pregnant. Right, right. So
exactly.
she's
Yep.
obviously she's fertile myrtle. Right. She's
Mhm.
anytime she's with him, she has babies, and Rebecca, Rachel is still left out of the loop because she's desperate, and that's the thing to me. When people are desperate, right,
Mhm.
they fall for these things, these magic and divination and all that stuff. They just fall for it when they're so desperate. Yeah.
And Rachel felt like she was the blessed one and the favored one, and she was. But Leah felt almost the opposite, like she was forgotten. She was just thrown in to the deal by her father because I guess he had to do something with her.
Yeah.
So she almost like Hagar. She's the forgotten one that is tossed aside and objectified, and God remembers and redeems through her fertility. And it's almost, I make a tie to our psalm here, Psalm 10, verse 1, just because we're reading it, and it's cool to interconnect our chapters here. But she's got to be crying out what the psalmist says. Why, oh Lord, do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? So she's got to be feeling that she's abandoned, and then God provides for her, and she's feeling very thankful through that, through
Yeah.
those through her children, which to your earlier point, Amber, Rachel doesn't seem to.
Yeah. Yeah. And through all of this, absolutely, I think you've really touched into what she has to be feeling. And through all of this, manipulating, kind of almost lying and bartering and trying to make things happen, God is still working. And one of the things we have to like pull back and remember, big picture, is that the other thing that's happening here is that you see the 12 tribes being born. Right. This is really about the 12 tribes coming up under Jacob and his 12 sons who become the 12 tribes. So when you get to verse 22, it seems almost like Jacob finally has this heir from his beloved wife, his most beloved wife. So he's going to, in his mind, this is Joseph, right? So from the beginning, it seems like Joseph, who's one of the youngest ones, and yet he's kind of going to be the heir because as soon as he's born, right after he's born, it's Jacob says, "Okay, time to go back now," right?
Yeah.
Time to go back to the promised land, back to home. because he now seems like he has this air, right? So it really is about the 12, which actually takes us, the 12 tribes, takes us to Matthew 10, right? Because in Matthew 10, you have the 12 apostles. Jesus is, I think, Amber, I think you said it's the first time. Is this the first time?
This is the first time in Matthew that the 12 has been listed as a group of 12, official title of the apostles or the disciples.
Right, the apostles. And so what does that word, Craig, did you get any insight into what the word, why he uses the word apostle?
Yeah, so apostle is a transliteration, or what we are calling in English a transliteration, or a literal translation of the Greek word, which is actually apostello, which is to send forth with a commission. That's what it means. And in the sense of the ancient days, we said this a couple of probably several weeks ago now, several podcasts ago now, with the word evangelion, the Greek word for evangelical or evangelizing, to send forth with a message. Well, here, these are the apostles are the actual ones who are sent out and charged and commissioned in the name of the king. This is in the sense of the literal king of a country or a territory back in the ancient days. They'll be the ones to send forth the royal message. There'll be the royal messenger sent forth with that royal message. And those who were charged to listen would be foolish to ignore the royal commission, to ignore the royal apostles. So in this sense, Jesus the King is sending out his apostles, his messengers, and we would be foolish not to listen to him. And we have you pointed out earlier the warnings at the end of chapter 10, Ellis, here, and we can get more into those, but it all ties together very nicely within that sense of these are the royal commissioners, and we see ourselves entering the story here. We're not apostles, of course, in the sense that they were, because we didn't spend time directly with Jesus in his physical presence. But we're disciples, and we are sent out to spread the gospel as Jesus followers.
Yeah, and you made a point that I think that's interesting with the whole word apostle and term, as in the kind of the apostolic age. Many believe has ended. So apostle, the way Paul defined it, was someone who had experienced Jesus firsthand, right, when he was alive and so forth. So in some ways we say, well, that we can't be that anymore. But in the bigger sense of the word apostle, we can still have apostles who basically are sent ones. They're not necessarily apostles in the biblical sense, but they are in the sense of that word, which means to be sent, because Ephesians tells us he gave some to be apostles, right? And so there is still that kind of gifting there of being that kind of a person. And then he gives them the message, and the message here that he's sending them with, which to your point, Craig, absolutely, these are representatives of King coming out with the message that's coming from the King. And the message is the kingdom of God is near, right? The kingdom of God is near. And to kind of undergird the authority of that message are all the what are called signs and wonders. And he gives them this list: do these things, heal the sick, raise the dead, heal the leper, cleanse the leper, exorcise the demons. And they go out and start doing this. And then don't take anything with you, right? So there's this long list Jesus gives us. Amber, did you get any insight into what is this that Jesus is doing with them as he sends them out and he gives them all these do's and don'ts, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking, I'm very much, you may or may not know this about me, I'm pretty sure you do. I'm pretty much a go-getter. And so like, if Jesus would be like, you can do all these things and I'm saying to go, I'm like, all right, I'm going. Like, you're going to give me these powers. I am on it. But then it's so weird because he is telling them to go. Here's all the things you can do, you will do in my name and my power. But then he says, but wait, just don't go there or there or here. You need to stay within these people. I'm like, that's a downer for me because I'm a go-getter. I'm like, you tell me to go, but then it's like, you can go run for it, but actually you just need to crawl. And right now I need you to crawl into this area. Help me understand that better for someone who just wants to go worldwide. Why is Jesus so specific in the area? Help us understand that.
Yeah, I mean, he says, I assume you're referring to don't go to the Gentiles or to the Samaritans, but
that's
to
right. Exactly.
The Israelites, right? And it seems like Jesus, hey, are you discriminating or what?
Yeah.
He did this with Gentiles because he interacted with Gentiles, and there were several places when he's, for instance, when he's on the other side in the Decapolis area, which was mostly on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, and it's mostly Gentile area. And so he even had one Gentile who came and says, hey, I'll follow you. I'll go wherever you want to go. I want to follow you now. And Jesus says, no, you stay here and preach to your people, and do that. So it seemed that what Jesus was doing was to building this nucleus, this group that was primarily and almost exclusively Jewish. He was going to the Jews. He understood that the blessing and the message was going to come through this Jewish nucleus of people who were going to go out then and spread the gospel to the whole world. But he seemed to have this understanding. Why did he choose 12 Jewish men? A lot of people point to the choice he made with the 12 and say, well, it's only men, so men are meant to do this. Well, wait a minute, no, it's not men, it's Jewish men. So if that was meant to be a forever thing, then no, it's not that only men should be leading, only Jewish men should be leading, right? But he didn't mean that to be a forever principle. He wasn't saying it always has to be only Jews and only Jewish men. He was sending a message about his movement, what his movement was about. And it was about the messianic promise, the Abrahamic promise to be a blessing. And that was going to come from the Jews, from the descendants of Abraham. And so he chose 12 of them. Why? Well, obviously, the 12 tribes, right? This is a new Israel, a new law, a fulfillment of the law that he is doing here. So it's very important for him that it come from this Jewish voice. It has to come from here, and then it'll spread to the whole world. So I think that's part of what's behind that.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. Speaking of the 12 and who is chosen here, I have some interesting facts about, I'm one of those weird people. When I see a list, I'm like, ooh, a list. Most people are like, get past the list and get to the good stuff. Yeah. I like the list. So I did some digging, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is really, really interesting. If you look at all the list of the different 12 apostles and all the gospels, none of them are the same list. Mm-hmm. They are all, that's a very interesting fact. Right? They're all a little different. But here's what's more interesting is what is similar. So I want to dig into what is so similar about all of these lists. And it's really, really good. At least I think it's cool. And I'm just nerdy. All the lists are, in all the gospels, is 3 groups of 4. The men are always listed in 3 groups of 4. Which is really interesting. Mm-hmm. And they always get sent out by 2s. We'll notice when he gives them the charge, they always go out as 2s. Mm-hmm. The second thing you want to notice is that in the groupings of 4, the first person's always the same. So for example, you have a group of 4 and Simon, who is called Peter, is always first in all the gospels. Mm-hmm. You have another group of 4 and Philip is always the top one of that group of 4. And then you have another group of 4 and James is always the first one listed in that group of 4. So we don't know for sure, but people who are smarter than me think that maybe there was some sort of ranking system within the disciples that we don't really know much about, but those guys were the top of the 4 listed. But every gospel is exactly the same in that way, which is really cool. Oh, yeah. Also, Judas is always listed last. Yeah. I mean, I always wonder, I'm like, that one's kind of obvious, but he's always listed last, which I think is significant for all the gospels. Yeah. One more thing. Things that you notice about this specific list in Matthew. So if you look at Matthew 10, this list here, you have all 12 men, but only 3 of them give extra specific information about them. And that's intentional, it's always intentional. Mm-hmm. So you have only 3 of them that give you extra information. One of them is Matthew. He's the tax collector. That's his extra information. He's a tax collector. Mm-hmm. Well, why is that mentioned, right? We just learned about him last week in our podcast and in our reading. Why is that mentioned? Well, because as in first century Jewish terms, being a tax collector, he was almost considered a traitor. Like he's on the fringe, like he might be a Jew and he might be following some, but he's really close to being out on the outside, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and he's not looked well upon amongst other Jews. But then another guy who is listed is Simon, the Zealot, right? Oh, yeah. Zealot was just another term for people who were extreme Jew, like going to fight with a sword to fight against Roman rule. They're very extreme on the Jew side. So you have them on full extreme this way with Simon, you have full extreme this way with Matthew. And I think it's really important to notice that God, I think the reason it's mentioned is because this is very intentional. Jesus chooses every person on far ends of the spectrum. You would think that Simon and Matthew probably would not get along very well, but they have to get along.
Oh, yeah. And it's and everything in between. Right.
Yes, exactly.
So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's good. That's a good catch. I
In the
did.
last one,
Mhm.
Judas, he's the only other one that has anything against him, and it says the one who betrayed him, because we know he does, and that's why it's listed, is because not only did he have people in the inner circle, but he had someone who we thought is in the circle, but his heart was moving away. I think it's important too.
Yeah, you almost have. If you've ever read the book about Abraham Lincoln by Kearns, is is the team of rivals, right? Where Abraham Lincoln put together this cabinet. There were a team of rivals, and somehow it worked, right? And it was brilliant, actually, and exactly what they needed. So you have here this kind of same thing where almost a team of rivals that they're just, and you wonder, well, no wonder they were always kind of arguing and bickering and trying to figure out, and they all had different opinions, and they all seem to think, well, Jesus is going to be this earthly ruler and leader, right? And so you have the zealot who is all over that, right? He wants to overthrow Rome, and so that's why he's there. But it's interesting that Jesus sends them out. So they've been following him for a while, and so they've seen him, they've watched him. He's done all these miracles, and now he's sending them out to do the same. And he tells them not only to go to these certain people, as you pointed out, Amber, but he also tells them, don't take anything with you, right? Don't take anything with you. It's almost this complete and total dependence on God, just this stripping all the way down to the absolute bare necessities, the sandals on your feet, a staff. That's it, right? And then go and just depend completely on God. And the thing that comes out of that whole scene for me, and the way he's describing it, is not only when you're completely dependent on God in this way, you're not responsible for the results. You don't have to worry about, you're not responsible for being successful. God's the one who makes you successful.
Mhm.
You're just responsible for being obedient and going out there and doing it. I mean, Craig, did you get anything on that, or along those lines, in that whole scene
Yeah,
with where he sends them out?
yeah, I definitely did. We talk about leaving baggage behind, leaving our physical material possessions behind to follow Jesus. That's the way we always rightfully think of this passage, because it's about how did they go out and spread the word, and it we kind of make it sound to ourselves in our materialistic culture. It's easy to rationalize. Well, they didn't have anything anyway. They were just these poor Jewish fishermen and tax collectors and other folks within the first century world. They didn't have a lot of possessions that was easy to leave behind. How hard is it to drop a fisher's net and go? But
Right.
it's not all that easy in our own world. Even if we don't want to go as far as giving up our possessions, how good are we at losing our emotional baggage, our feelings of guilt and shame and retribution and anger that continue to drag us down and keep us away from following Christ and focusing on Him?
Hmm.
You rightfully pointed out this morning in your sermon, Ellis, that we had Ash Wednesday this past week, and so now we're in the season of Lent.
Hmm.
In the season of Lent, which is our preparatory journey to get our hearts right for Easter and get ready for the resurrection of our Lord, there's that period of reflection and the ability to look within ourselves and our relationship with Jesus, and understand what is that baggage that's weighing us down, and what can we give up and discard during the Lenten season so we can focus more on Jesus. And I think that's the message that undergirds this passage and this entire sending uh, speech that Jesus gives throughout chapter 10 is drop what is keeping you from following me and focusing on me. And here's some ways that can help. And here's some instructions I'm going to give you to make it easier for you. But to your earlier point, the results are not up to us. That is, we are to plant the seed and the Spirit will come in and sow.
Yeah, no, I love that connection that you just made between the baggage, not taking any bags with you, and the emotional baggage, psychological baggage that we carry with us, which is a lot harder to get rid of than our real baggage, right? I mean, tell me to simplify my life and clean out my closet and just live simpler. That's really attractive to me. I like that idea. I like the idea of having, I have too much junk. I like the idea of getting rid of my physical stuff to travel lighter, but to start telling me, well, you also have to, there's a lot of people you have to forgive, a lot of stuff that's happened to you in the past that you're hurting from, your relationship with your dad or whatever, right? Oh, I've got to, oh, you want me to deal with that? No, I don't want to deal with that, right? That's a lot harder to get rid of. So that's I think a great connection that he makes, that you've made there. It's almost like, too, when he sends them out, it's almost a callback to this Abrahamic promise where with Abraham, God said, "You will be a blessing to the whole world." And he says, "I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you." And here, as Jesus is sending his disciples out, right? He says, the one who welcomes you in, which is the way he describes it. It's this they call it a person of peace, right? Who welcomes you into hospitality, that person will be blessed. And the one who rejects you, right, that person will be cursed. Did you get that, Amber, from this scene, this whole tie to that Abrahamic promise? And then he goes into the warnings of the persecution that you're going to go through, right? So I don't know if you got anything from any of that, Amber.
I don't know if I'll answer your question exactly how you asked it, but the thing that I think I keep thinking about when I was reading these chapters this week, is that when you meet the real Jesus, that's what they're doing. They're going out and forerunners. They are preparing these people. Jesus is coming. The kingdom is coming. Their job was to proclaim and to announce. And when you meet the real Jesus, there's only it requires a response. And I think there's three responses. Either you're going to have an open mind, a blown mind, or a closed mind.
Okay.
I think this is the only three responses. And we are not responsible for which one that is. But what we can do is not convince or sway, but just pronounce and proclaim and announce it. Because when you meet the real Jesus, a response is required. And if anything, I've read this in a book before, if anything is called tactics, I at least leave a pebble in their shoe. Even though I may wipe off the dust off my sandal, I hope to leave a pebble in their shoe.
Oh, that's good. I like the pebble in the shoe thing. Yeah, that it stays with them. Fred Craddock, one of my favorite preaching profs, talked about preaching, and it's the message becomes like that piece of tape that you're trying to get off your finger, and it keeps sticking, and you take it off and it still sticks, and the message should stick that way where it's with you all week long. I love that idea. That's really good. Yeah, he goes into this place, and he really is asking the disciples to share this message, and it's almost like, the message is enough itself, right? Don't try to be this. And Paul said this. He says, "I didn't come to you with fancy words, with eloquence and with all this. I just came to you with the power of the Holy Spirit." It's almost Paul is saying, it's not the fancy words. And sometimes Jesus is almost telling them, don't be like your ancestor Jacob, right? And try to manipulate and try to get people. That's not your job to manipulate it, because it's not going to work. It just never works, right? It's really the message. And sometimes we don't trust that the message enough. The gospel message, it will carry it. It carries the power. And all you have to do is really deliver that. So he goes into this place where it's really, he gives them all these warnings at the end of chapter 10, right? And then really calls them to this crazy kind of thing. The first one, verse 38, is, if you don't pick up your cross and follow me, right? You have to pick up your cross. That's a pretty heavy duty thing. You have to remember the cross was this crucifixion. It was this execution rack. That's what it was. It meant suffering to the ultimate degree. And then also welcoming, right? Welcoming the person, the stranger. And then that's in verse 40. Verse 42 is the cup of cold water, right? So what did you guys get from that?
I think the progression from cross to hospitality to cup of water, it's almost like a diminishing set of demands. That's kind of shouted out at me. It's almost like if you can't do the cross, if you can't welcome people, you can at least start with a cup of water. Surely you can do that as a follower of me. And then you build up. I don't know if that's right or not, but that was interesting. But it comes back to the sense of the ordinary person just living the life that God has called them to. If we all did that, this world would be a much nicer place. And I can't help, coming off of Matthew 5, 6, and 7, we had the the Sermon on the Mount in those chapters. Started with the Beatitudes in chapter 5. I hope this isn't sacrilegious, but I almost have this sense of Jesus saying here, blessed are you who are ordinary, because in you is the fullness of God. I almost feel that here.
No, good. I don't think that's sacrilegious at all. I think that's a good point. Yeah. Amber, did you have anything off of these or any questions about that?
No, I don't. I just think that I have in the notes verses 32 and 33, where we already sort of talk about it, where whoever therefore shall confess me before men, my Father which is in heaven, but whoever shall deny me will deny men. and will deny me before my Father, which is in heaven. I just wrote down those are heavy, heavy verses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something hard to think about.
Mm-hmm.
We have a responsibility here, and I think that's a great place to end and say, look, you guys, this week as you read these scriptures, I pray that God will speak to you and that He'll use them to speak right to your heart. We've given you a few clues. These are almost like breadcrumbs along the way because it doesn't cover everything, but we just want to encourage you, and we want God to bless you this week. So stay with it. Keep going with the Well Bible reading journey. And I know that God is going to change your life. God bless you and see you next week.
Bye.